For years, people have accepted one strange fact about the Defiant. It had a cloaking device.
It's definitely a Federation starship, but I've never seen that design before.
Federation ship? The cloaking device?
Not just any cloaking device, a Romulan cloaking device. And the Romulans didn't hand it over freely. They imposed conditions. The Defiant could only use cloak under specific circumstances. A Romulan officer would need to monitor its use. The Federation would remain accountable.
She's here to operate the cloaking device, which her government so kindly loaned us for this mission.
Romulan interests will be served through cooperation, and my role is to keep unauthorized personnel away from the cloaking device.
On paper, it was one of the most tightly controlled technology sharing agreements in Starfleet history. And then, everyone forgot about it. The Defiant went on covert missions. It fought the Dominion. It became one of Starfleet's most important warships. Yet, the Romulan observer seemingly vanished. The restrictions disappeared, the complaints stopped, and nobody ever seemed to ask why. But here's the problem. The more important the Defiant became, the less sense that explanation makes. Because if you were the Romulans, why would you stop watching? The Dominion War was giving you something priceless. Every battle, every engagement, every use of that cloak against the greatest military threat in the quadrant. The Defiant wasn't becoming less valuable to Romulan intelligence, it was becoming more valuable than ever. So what happened? Did the Romulans simply lose interest in one of the most important pieces of military technology they had ever shared with a foreign power? Did Starfleet quietly begin ignoring the agreement? Or was something else happening behind the scenes? What if the Observer didn't disappear at all? What if the Romulans never stopped monitoring the Defiant? What if the arrangement simply moved out of sight? Hidden within intelligence channels, buried beneath classified reports, and quietly managed by people neither Starfleet officers nor Deep Space Nine's crew were ever meant to see. Because the real mystery may not be why the Romulans stopped watching the Defiant. The real mystery is why we assume they ever stopped. So let's investigate one of the strangest plot holes that appear to exist. A conspiracy theory that may involve Romulan intelligence, Starfleet intelligence, and perhaps even Section 31 itself. To understand why the disappearance of Romulan oversight is so strange, we first need to understand just how significant the original agreement actually was. For most of Starfleet's history, cloaking devices were one of the most closely guarded technologies in the Alpha and Beta quadrants. The Romulans considered them a strategic advantage. The Federation, meanwhile, was largely prohibited from developing or deploying cloaking technology due to treaty obligations dating back decades. Whether Starfleet officers liked those restrictions or not, they generally followed them. Cloaks were simply not part of the Federation's arsenal. That is what makes the Defiant so unusual. When the Federation received permission to equip the vessel with a Romulan cloak, it wasn't because the Romulans suddenly became generous. They agreed because both powers had a mutual interest in gathering intelligence from the Gamma Quadrant and learning more about the Dominion. Even then, the Romulans attached conditions. The cloak was not a gift, it was a loan. The Defiant's use of the device would be monitored. A Romulan officer would be assigned to oversee operations. The technology would remain under Romulan control. From the Romulan perspective, this arrangement made perfect sense. They were allowing a foreign power to operate one of their most valuable military technologies. And of course, they would want oversight. They wanted someone on board making sure Starfleet wasn't using the cloak in ways that violated the agreement. And initially, that's exactly what happened. We see the Romulan observer, we hear the restrictions discussed. The Romulans make a point of reminding us that this is not normal. The Defiant is operating under special circumstances, and everyone involved seems to understand that. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the Romulans cared enough to demand oversight in the first place, why'd they ever stop? After all, the Defiant wasn't becoming less important, it wasn't seeing less action. If anything, the exact opposite was happening. As the tensions grew with the Dominion, the Defiant evolved from an experimental escort assigned to Deep Space Nine into one of the most important strategic assets in Starfleet. And that's where the story starts to get strange. Because the more important the Defiant became, the less visible Romulan oversight was. And that is exactly the opposite of what one would expect. Originally conceived as an answer to the Borg threat, the Defiant was never intended to be a traditional Starfleet vessel. It was smaller, more heavily armed, and built around combat in a way few Federation ships ever had been. As tensions with the Dominion increased, those characteristics made it increasingly valuable. By the time the Dominion War erupted, the Defiant was no longer an experimental escort attached to Deep Space Nine. It had become one of Starfleet's most important frontline assets. And that should have transformed how the Romulans viewed the arrangement they had made with Starfleet. Because the Defiant was no longer simply carrying a Romulan cloaking device. It was carrying a cloaking device into some of the most important military operations in the quadrant. Every mission would generate information. Every battle revealed something about Dominion tactics. Every encounter exposed strengths, weaknesses, sensor capabilities, and operational patterns. But perhaps most importantly, every deployment revealed something about Starfleet itself. How did Federation officers use stealth technology? How did they conduct reconnaissance during wartime? How did Captain Sisko approach military operations? Did Starfleet adapt when forced into a conflict that it had spent centuries trying to avoid? Those aren't questions the Romulans would ignore. They are questions intelligence agencies build entire operations around so that they can answer, which creates an interesting possibility. What if the Romulans eventually realized that the cloak itself was no longer the most valuable part of the arrangement? What if the real prize was the ship carrying it? Because from a Romulan perspective, the Defiant had become something extraordinary. It was one of the Federation's most active warships. It regularly participated in high-level operations. It carried senior officers. It fought major battles. It was often at the center of events that would shape the future of the Alpha and Beta quadrants. In other words, it had become an intelligence goldmine. And that is why the traditional explanation feels incomplete. We are asked to believe that as the Defiant became more valuable, Romulan interest somehow decreased. That as the ship participated in increasingly important operations, the people responsible for monitoring the cloak simply faded away. Intelligence organizations rarely abandon valuable sources of information, especially during wartime, which raises a troubling possibility. Perhaps the Romulans never stopped monitoring the Defiant at all. Perhaps they simply stopped doing it in ways Starfleet could easily see. And if that happened, it would explain one of the strangest questions around the entire arrangement. The observer disappeared, but did the observation ever actually stop? If Romulan monitoring continued after the observer vanished, then the next question becomes obvious. How? Because by the Dominion War, the Defiant was generating far more intelligence than a single observer could realistically collect on their own. After all, a visible observer can only collect so much information. They can sit on the bridge, read reports, watch operations unfold, but by the time the Dominion War is underway, the amount of intelligence being generated by the Defiant is enormous. Far more than a single officer could realistically focus on their own. Whatever monitoring existed would almost certainly have required additional channels. And that possibility becomes especially interesting when we remember one critical detail. The Federation wasn't operating Federation technology. It was operating Romulan tech. The cloak wasn't built, designed, or understood by Starfleet engineers. The Romulans remained the true experts on the system throughout the entire arrangement. That doesn't prove the cloak was secretly transmitting information back to Romulan intelligence. There isn't really any canon evidence for that, but it does raise some uncomfortable questions. How much access did the Romulans retain to the technology after it was installed? What kind of performance reports were being generated? What information was exchanged when the system required maintenance? How often were technical evaluations conducted, and how much of that process continued after the observer stopped appearing on screen? Those questions become even more important when we remember what the Defiant was actually doing. Any diagnostic, maintenance, or performance data associated with those missions could potentially reveal far more than the status of the cloak itself, which again continues to raise uncomfortable possibilities. What if the Observer was never the primary monitoring mechanism to begin with? If the Romulans continued collecting information from the Defiant, then somebody inside Starfleet certainly knew about the arrangement and knew it was still active. I'm not talking about Captain Sisko nor anyone on Defiant's crew. Someone higher. Someone operating far enough from the ship that they could see the strategic value of the arrangement rather than the day-to-day reality aboard the vessel. Which raises the most important question of all. If the Romulans were still watching, why would Starfleet allow it? At first glance, the idea sounds absurd. Why would Starfleet allow Romulans continued access to information connected to one of the most important warships? Why would anyone tolerate a foreign power potentially learning about Federation tactics, military operations, and wartime strategy? The Romulans would gain insight into both Dominion operations and Federation wartime doctrine. But the Federation benefited as well. The Defiant kept its cloak. The original arrangement remained intact. Starfleet retained access to technology it otherwise would not possess. More importantly, communication channels with the Romulan Empire remained open during one of the most dangerous periods in Federation history. Which brings us to Section 31. Throughout Deep Space Nine, Section 31 repeatedly demonstrates a willingness to sacrifice transparency in pursuit of strategic goals. Sloan manipulates allies, operates without oversight, withholds information from Starfleet officers. Even when those actions cross ethical lines, Section 31 consistently justifies them using the same logic. If the Federation survives, the methods are irrelevant. Viewed through that lens, the Defiant arrangement begins to look very different. What if Section 31 never viewed continued Romulan intelligence collection as a problem? What if it viewed it as an investment? From Section 31's perspective, continued intelligence sharing may have served a larger strategic goal. The more the Romulans understood the Dominion threat, the harder neutrality became to justify. Suddenly, the arrangement benefits everyone involved. The Romulans receive valuable intelligence, the Federation keeps access to the cloak, Starfleet gains a stronger strategic relationship with the Empire, and Section 31 gets something it values above all else: another mechanism for drawing a powerful future ally into the war. Does that prove Section 31 was involved? No, of course not. But it does something more important. If the intelligence relationship continued after the Observer disappeared, Section 31 had every reason to allow it, perhaps even encourage it. Not because they were helping the Romulans, but because helping the Romulans ultimately helped the Federation. And if there is one lesson Deep Space Nine teaches us about Section 31, it is that they are always willing to do the wrong thing today if they believe it produces the right outcome tomorrow. The official story is simple. The Romulans loaned the Federation a cloaking device. They assigned an observer. The Defiant carried out its mission. Eventually, the observer faded into the background, and the arrangement largely disappeared from the story. For many viewers, that's where the question ends, but the more closely we examine the situation, the harder that explanation becomes to accept. We cannot prove the Romulans continued monitoring the Defiant after their observer disappeared. We cannot prove Section 31 played any role in preserving the arrangement, but the unanswered questions remain. Perhaps the observer disappeared, perhaps the oversight became invisible, perhaps the arrangement evolved into something neither the Defiant's crew nor most Starfleet officers fully understood. We can't prove that happened, just as we can't prove Section 31 played any role in it, but we do know three things. The Romulans had a motive to keep watching. The information remained valuable throughout the war, and someone inside Starfleet had every reason to allow the arrangement to continue. Maybe the observer left. Maybe the report stopped. Maybe the Romulans simply forgot about one of the most significant technology sharing agreements in their history. Or maybe the real secret of the Defiant's cloak isn't that the Romulans stopped watching. It's that they were always watching. And if that's true, then one of the Federation's greatest warships may have spent the Dominion War fighting two battles at once. The one everyone could see, and the intelligence war happening quietly in the shadows.